Elijah Cross, a sergeant major, had never received his Medal of Honor for his efforts in truth, that he made every effort to conceal it. Beneath the surface of stillness and humility, he wasn't like the way some men wore scars, the kind to brag or make a statement in a space, however, when he arrived. Judge William Monday's wet courtroom in Alcott. He's followed by morning quiet like a shadow rain lightly drummed against the tall courthouse's windows where time itself appeared to be as slow inside as with his immaculate army. Elijah stood tall, wear a uniform that is marked not just with decorations and ranks, but with recollection. Courtroom suffering and bravery were already full to overflowing, not only with onlookers, but civilians who are emotionally invested carrying folded flags. In their gold laps, black and white clenching by star moms pictures of their torsos and lines of veterans, nodding in silence to the man who had turned into a legend in their culture. Elijah wasn't there to protect himself, but to speak for someone else. A veteran's fellow soldier was charged with misbehavior that may be observed by him disgracefully fulfilled Elijah's duty, merely a character witness. But his very existence turned into the narrative as he moved forward to take the lead in the court. The crowd's gaze followed him. Many were overcome with silent awe, while others just inquisitive. Judge Elkhart modified his straining their spectacles as though irritated by the Elijah's uniform's weight ornaments, and possibly his flesh. The judge was known for being a guy of rigid, arrogant, and rule-devoid kindness. Having overseen hundreds of trials with a large number of veterans, but never triumphed nearly like this at this time, Elijah faced away from the podium, the bench with an unwavering posture, straight, his presence nearly as well strong enough to disregard Judge Alcott's leaning forward a little, and gave a sentence that would eventually discolor his legacy. Removes that asterisk T for all time. At first, it was difficult to believe that the soldier, after saying that, a murmur echoed like a wind through the gallery. Elijah didn't move when the leaves were dry. He remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the little gleaming medal. Was judged. A blue-draped star resting slightly below this is a courtroom, and his throat remains untouched. The judge continued louder, not a stage. Now his tone was tinged with contempt and disguised disdain. Remove it, or take a seat. The quiet that ensued was more weight than any gavel. Yet Elijah could still feel blood in his ears. Out of rage, but recalling how he obtained the medal, of the men who lost their lives in Kandahar's desert canyon, were cried out for God and their moms in the same breath from which he extracted them. Gunfire, burning, and the stench of diesel flesh. The sniper's round echo that medal almost cost him his life. It was a weight, not a spectacle, or a sign of the things he wishes he had never witnessed. Such bravery, never observed, but the judge thought it was ornamentation, as a political performance. Needless to say, Elijah didn't move, talk, but in that instant, everything appeared to change in the courtroom. The veterans stood silently in the rear row, some people raising their hands in protest. One woman softly sobbed in their hearts, holding on to her brother's dog tags who had lost their lives in the same conflict as Elijah. Withstood the gavel being banged by the judge, landing an order twice, but it was the wound had been opened too late. It was always more than just the medal. Regarding what it stood for and who was donning it, the nerve had been hit in the black-robed man who forgot Elijah. What true honor looked like at last. He spoke in a stern yet calm tone. Affluent, dignified, and treated with respect. I wear this for your honor, not for me. But that was all he could do for those who couldn't. He didn't raise his voice, he had to say. He just stood there without defending himself, as though he had been standing above his brother's bodies abroad, just as he had stood at as many funerals as he had attended. The unidentified soldier's tomb during his ceremonial duties remained stationary, unwavering and reluctant to give up. The judge's red-faced bent towards what was important, returning to his seat, but the harm was completed. It was no longer his in the courtroom. It belonged to Elijah, but in reality, he transported into the locked stories the media refused to cover that medal. Instantly, murmurs would transform into headlines that would be captured by outside cameras, the grave expressions leaving the courtroom. Some people are crying, while others are carrying images of sons never came back. And in the middle of Elijah Cross is not defiant at all. It's arrogant, but merely make a living evidence of the sacrifice made in order to defend not his deeds, But his own dignity, the Medal of Honor, shouldn't be questioned in a legal proceeding, but that it was the day, and it was more noisy than any of the courtroom drama could never be judged. That started with an impolite order would turn into a national discussion, a motion, and eventually a reckoning. But when 5 words cut for the first time after decades of quiet, a novel form of the conflict started, not in a faraway country, but on U.S. territory in a courtroom where, for a while, justice had become confused about the courtroom where the fire started did not remain. Inside its foreoak, it spread like dried grass in the prison walls. The wind sparking discussions in online radio chat shows about veterans' halls, military forums, and ultimately in the nation's court of hearts between tradition, justice, and discomfort facts about its past in a matter of hours, Sergeant Majors. Directive from Judge Alcott: Elijah Cross will take off his medal. A few excerpts from the court transcript about honor started making the rounds on the internet with a youthful court posted a single cue. He instructed a combat hero to strip the highest honor in the country in front of family in mourning. That post was shared 10,000 times in an hour, then 1,000, then a load of Elijah's screenshots standing with the medal without flinching. His eyes remained steady on his chest. Overnight, straight became idols. The military community responded. First, SEALs, Marines, retired generals, and soldiers and Air Force pilots, some of whom are just about able to walk protests across the nation in support for the individual who never looked for the spotlight. That the man was entitled to wear it at any event, including funerals, said in a video. A 3-star general became viral by day's end. And others told tales about Elijah that weren't from the headlines, but based on first-hand knowledge. A young interpreter from Afghanistan wrote that a man who carried to saved my village. 5 miles under fire, the wounded boy survived. He didn't mention it at all. My son's name is, wrote the Gold Star mother. Elijah held my hand on the jewelry he wears. Hand during his burial, he is not required to remove the medal he has won from not our disdain. But Judge Williams' quiet Alcott was immersed in a mix of conceit and haughtiness. And defensiveness did not change courtroom etiquette must be. Followed, informed a local news organization that this isn't regarding race or military service, it concerns upholding the sacredness of the court. But he did not comprehend, or perhaps declined to do so, was that Elijah Cross stood for something distant. Beyond the confines of military protocol, he was the walking representation of a legacy carved into, with horrific suffering and blood. The bravery that medal lacked demonstrate how it was scorched by the heat of each fight. Every comrade who has died, every muttered prayer while being fired at by Alcott had told Elijah to take it off. Not only made fun of a man he had stepped on each soldier's memory that medal stood in for the public court, opinion, in contrast to Alcott, lacked patience. Protesters started to show up with excuses. Within 48 hours outside the courthouse, not in rage or with bullhorns, but with veterans in uniforms stood in silence, holding signs from shoulder to shoulder with basic messages. He deserved it, wouldn't you? Have addressed a white medal with that. This court needs to remind the receiver of honor. A team of Medal of Honor recipients, a rare joint was released by the recipients. Declaration criticizing the judge's actions, an unparalleled display of disrespect by the statement that more than 24 people co-signed "No American is read by honored veterans. It's particularly not a man who has contributed more than the majority, ought to be requested to take out the highest honor for bravery. In the country when once more serving in the military justice this time, that phrase justice started to change the story. Elijah wasn't the only focus anymore. It was about a more profound systemic disrespect towards black veterans in the corridors of authority. The erasure of their sacrifices, the historical trend. To question their honor, their positions, and civil rights organizations' values swiftly noticed the black NAACP chapters. Veterans United, as well as non-military people rights organizations, started tying Elijah's tale to an extensive series of historical unfair treatment by segregated units and 2 black veterans of World War II. Being refused recognition and benefits after Vietnam, this wasn't an isolated incident. Elijah Cross had a pattern, and unwittingly turned into its face. Elijah himself, however, said nothing. Declined every interview he was given. silently to his Alexandrian home, visited his elderly mother, and worked as a volunteer at the VA medical facility and continued his formal obligations at the tomb of the every action the unknown soldier did was intentional. It's not out of strategy, but he didn't want to be a symbol, in principle. He wished to simply stand for what he believed in honor, responsibility, and remembering Judge Alcott. Meanwhile, became more initially alone. He attempted painting himself as the misinterpreted casualty of cancel culture, but his claims were rejected. He is fairly ruled for flat veterans in previous cases, retracted their support for he was regarded as rigorous by a former law clerk, aloof and contemptuous of everything outside the courthouse experience he had. Once respected location is today a hub of every morning tension protesters showed up. Journalists prowled the parking lot and inside the gallery at each new hearing. Veterans quietly showed up in some uniform, while some are dressed in streetwear, calmly gazing at the bench as a reminder that the country's eyes were observing. But the quiet majesty of Elijah was the main factor that undermined Alcott's defense. Without holding any news conferences, without yelling or requesting an Elijah's apology, revealed to the world what true strength appeared to be more than just moral but bodily in a period when outrage was money. So he decided to be humble, and it had a deeper impact than any tirade ever could. Lawmakers eventually start speaking up. A Georgia senator, he was a former Marine who was known as the judge's actions are shameful for the judicial system. A bill was put forth that the Elijah Cross Act was created to safeguard the any Medal of Honor recipient's entitlement to appear in any civilian court wearing their reward, ritual or public area, but Elijah refused to pursue retribution when questioned by a friend why he hadn't made a public statement. "I didn't do any of this," he stated simply. "I did it because I was asked to be heard, to appear, and I will not degrade those who didn't turn this around in return. It's into a battle for me, but it's still stormy." Was coming together not out of anger, but out concluding that it wasn't about a medal, just one man, or maybe one courtroom. No more. It was about what the country do to those who sacrificed their lives for its liberty. And somewhere in the depths of an office of the courthouse, behind drawn blinds with an unread pile of hate letters on a desk, Judge Alcott started to understand that his garment was no longer protective. From the reality of the conflict that had started with a subtly offensive remark had become a widespread need for something distant. It was more than just an apology. It was now a demand restoration for the sake of honor and for acknowledging, in full, the sacrifices that had long since been disregarded. And Sergeant Major Elijah Cross remained silent, had changed into a soldier who was still standing, not just in front of the grave, but also in the conscience of a country finally compelled to examine yourself in front of the mirror. Life. That the medal was a weight, not a showpiece. Wore a sign of the things he wishes he had never witnessed such bravery. He never looked for. But the judge thought it was ornamentation as a political performance. Needless to say, Elijah didn't move, talk, but in that instant, everything appeared to change in the courtroom. The veterans stood silently in the rear row, some people raising their hands in protest. One woman softly sobbed in their hearts, holding on to her brother's dog tags, who had lost their lives in the same conflict as Elijah, withstood the gavel being banged by the judge, demanding an order twice, but it was the wound had been opened too late. It was always more than simply the medal. Regarding what it stood for, and who was both the nerve it touched and the person wearing it. The black-robed man who forgot Elijah, what true honor looked like at last. He spoke in a stern yet calm tone, fluent, dignified, entreated with respect. "I wear this for your honor, not for me." But that was all he could do for those who couldn't. He didn't raise his voice, he had to say. He just stood there without defending himself, as though he had been standing above his brother's bodies abroad. Just as he had stood at as many funerals as he had attended the unidentified soldier's tomb during his ceremonial duties, remained stationary, unwavering and reluctant to give up. The judge's red-faced bent towards what was important, returning to his seat, but the harm was completed. It was no longer his in the courtroom. It belonged to Elijah, but in reality he transported and to the locked stories the media refused to cover that medal. Instantly, but murmurs would transform into headlines that would be captured by outside cameras, the grave expressions leaving the courtroom. "Some people are crying. while others are carrying images of sons never came back, and in the middle of Elijah Cross is not defiant at all. Arrogant, but merely make a living evidence of the sacrifice made in order to defend not his deeds, but his own dignity. The Medal of Honor shouldn't be questioned in a legal proceeding. But that day was, and it was more noisy than anything else. The courtroom drama could never be judged. That started with an impolite order would turn into a national discussion, a motion, and eventually a reckoning. But when 5 words cut for the first time after decades of quiet, a novel form of the conflict started not in a faraway country, but on U.S. territory, in a courtroom where for a while justice had become confused about the calendars, had the dates circled. Across military installations, veteran centers, as well as on the desks of those who the day Elijah Cross would appear, before Congress go back to court without being a mute witness, not as a contentious emblem, but rather as a man's legal right to communicate was granted. And more crucially, to be heard, that day, the courtroom was not in the same its structure. But its mood is heavy with a sense of excitement laced with feeling, and veterans who were completely electrified filled every take a seat if you're going thousands of kilometers. To observe a double amputee in action in the front row, Marine was draped in medals, his mouth tight in resistance. A former P behind him silently held a picture of his unit, including civilians, came to teach at the church high school. Pupils who were brought by their parents and elders of color who had witnessed too many males. Elijah was silenced too many times. Too many generations in courtrooms, there was simply no possibility of objections. Undivided, motionless presence outside the courthouse. With an approximate population of 6,000 stood with folded flags in the cold and signed by hand. It was a vigil demonstration, and inside, in that crowded room, everyone's eyes were on when Elijah Cross arrived. He was not wearing this time in military gear, but wearing a dapper black suit and his Medal of Honor. Lying like a wound over his heart that refused to shut, but he did smile. He just strolled in silence without waving. Assurance of a man who had supported continues to live in his arms while bullets fly and transported a more weighty reality. Into Judge Elkhart, a place not designed for it, was seated and already noticeably smaller than he had just been there a few weeks before his. Elijah's eyes were averted by the court. The gavel was the name the officer announced. Hit once, but it sounded hollow. Elijah took the stage, and for the first time since the dispute started, he spoke as a man, not as a headline. His voice was serene, war-worn in each phrase. Carefully considered, each quiet weighted syllable, not even the he started, the court could measure your honor. I arrived here a few weeks ago to represent. I wore my earned uniform to another man, not to garner praise or attention, but due to the fact that I assured the moms of the folks who passed away next to me, whom would I wear this medal to remember? Them. For pride, but as they were unable to, the silence in the room allowed you to hear. AI gasped as you instructed me to take out. You treated me disrespectfully by disregarding the names. I had men who died yelling with me. Men in the sand who were destroyed saving other males who pleaded with me to keep. That is how their mothers perceive them, Elijah. His gaze paused and shifted to the exhibit. Looking into the eyes of a woman with this medal, he added, folding the flag, using 2 fingers to carefully lift it. It belongs to Corporal, not me. The person who leaped on a grenade, Darnell. Hughes must protect his squad from Ray Torres. Private who bled out after being shot in the neck and I'm calling for his sister with my arms. Belonged to the men who failed to show up. Back. At last the judge turned to face him. However, Elijah didn't recoil. It wasn't he was speaking in order to be forgiven. You called it history. It's unsuitable, he muttered. But this isn't. A costume. It's not theater. The last section of men's stories were trimmed short, and there was no bench, no robe. Title might reverse what they provided. There was a roar of stillness in that room. Stillness that was so dense that it crushed. Into the lungs a quiet that was more powerful than protests or not as loud as anger. Politics. It was the truthful silence, and something in the room was broken. Slow people. It could never be put back. Started by elevating the veterans, then the civilians, one by one, without cheering words, simply standing silently a claim of humanity and respect the 2 times the judge's gavel struck, but nobody Elijah was moved. But instead of grinning, he just turned to face the families behind him and nodded, and went back to his chair. The time was subsequently referred to by a reporter as the judge stood motionless that day. Retracted court with no remarks, although it was evident that the electricity was no longer behind it, stood on the courtroom bench, tall, dark, and indestructible inside the floor. The video shows Elijah's testimony, 24 hours. Silently captured on a person's phone, had more than 30 million despite the ban. Military historians referred to it as one among the most significant public declarations created by an active veteran in the previous century. Academic institutions started utilizing it, and preachers and ethics classes cited it in Sunday speeches. Even those who have criticized behind him, Elijah was now silent. Astonished by an unexpected fact to strike the Medal of Honor so deeply, the public asked that his remarks be permanently joined even before Congress started. The congressional record mentioned in order to agitate members across the aisle. The remarks made by Elijah during committee hearings, and there was a renewed push for the Elijah Cross's performance. But throughout, Elijah didn't change when questioned by a reporter's experience of winning at last, claimed that winning was never the goal of this, about keeping Judge Alcott in mind, but that was the first moment. Judicial oversight panels at the end launched official investigations over his behavior. Not from radicals, the letters came pouring in, but from the Gold Star families of judges. General and veterans of all races and ethnicities, he apologized after 2 days. Written declaration devoid of feeling, using expressions such as regrettable miscommunication and misreading of judicial etiquette. 8. But the country had already decided that he had not just insulted a man he had neglected to respect, a legacy he had turned into the spokesperson for what the United States was still having trouble outgrowing, and the individual he attempted to quiet had turned into the voice of what it sorely needs had. To recall the quiet that had once went inside that courtroom with Elijah had become a shout, not one of rage, but of waking, and as others discussed, questioned, or attempted to distort the story. Elijah. Krauss just came back, responsibility, standing at the tomb once more of the unidentified soldier, unarmed and motionless, and fearless. But now, when visitors, they saw more than just a guard as they passed him. They observed a country that was still under protection, not from adversaries overseas, but from forgetting who covered a man's expenses, ultimately compelled to face a reality he had avoided the fact all his life. There were boundaries to authority, and those boundaries, having attracted a man who didn't bring up his tone, wasn't combative or demanding, but just stood for the next few weeks. The evidence of Elijah Cross in the courts, once controlled by rigidity and fear, resonated with a distinct sound. Comments about accountability submitted by civil rights lawyers, veterans groups, and some judges even disclosed that the Elijah's moment wasn't a one-time occurrence. It was the beginning of a trend. Practice of subtly discriminatory remarks, decisions, and a persistent lack of deference for witnesses and defendants of color, particularly those wearing uniforms in the courts. The matter was discovered by oversight committees. Following the instance of Alcott interrupting black veterans, rejecting PTSD-related motions, defending or mocking people who have used military duty to elucidate one's character or situation that had been discussed for years, have now seeped into public documents, and his gavel before the court of public opinion no longer held weight. Instead, it was now an emblem of conceit and misdirected authority, of the sort of fairness that appeared to one outside of it and another in uniform. Alcott nevertheless made an effort to remain calm. He showed up for a hard interview, cold-eyed and necked, asserting that he was the smear campaign victim. But when the journalist questioned him if he felt sorrow, requesting that Sergeant Major Cross take out, he hesitated too long to give his Medal of Honor. "I'm sorry, that was misinterpreted," responded, and his fate was determined. Just the clip going around social media and national television deprived him of his remaining defense. There was not any miscommunication, been disrespectful, and for once, the country wasn't averting his gaze while Elijah Cross carried on with his silent mission. Didn't advocate for Alcott's dismissal. He didn't take pleasure in the rage of the public. What soldiers do, he took the burden, returning to his posts in silence to visit schools, offering guidance to younger veterans at the VA, and going to the deceased's funeral comrades without any publicity or cameras. He was presented with book deals, speaking TV contracts, and engagements, all of which he courteously declined. I remained silent so I might turn like something he once told. He was questioned by a young Marine why he never profited from the attention. I gave because that's all that needed to be said, but some would not allow a group of officially retired. Generals petitioned that Alcott will be removed by the judges due to moral inappropriateness and a betrayal of public confidence. There was unanimous approval of the Elijah Cross Act. Congress is not only defending the Medal of Respect the rights of recipients in court, but extending protections for recognition to all honored veterans in public for once. Civic engagement or service, the rooms were filled with bipartisan applause. America has discovered something uncommon. Agreement reached outside of political parties but principle. But Elijah still didn't go back to the news stories he was still in, where he had consistently been, by the ones who was unable to communicate while still. So they were able to recall Judge Alcott, but was denied the respectability of silence. The last hearing due to the supervision board was live-streamed to the public with 2 retirees and 3 widowed from the military judges attesting to the harm to culture his remarks had led to the boards. The chairwoman read the judge's decision. William Alcott would be there forever, deprived of their title and prohibited from ever hosting a public office once more. The crowd did not applaud. They simply stood in a courtroom, with once observed a man attempt to degrade a. The hero now stood silently in awe of the man who had never asked for their devotion. But it was earned with each breath. Elijah Cross was absent from the hearing. Rather, he stood that morning at Arlington White Gloves, laying on a rifle, eyes forward at his side in a storm, protecting the grave of the, as he had done for years. An unknown soldier, his jacket was wet by rainfall, broke the sky, yet he didn't recoil. A nearby child questioned her father about why her father muttered, "The soldier didn't move," when he is advocating for someone who can't news outlets make an announcement that night. Alcott's departure and long-term disappearance, people would remember his name, but not respected. But Elijah still did not rejoice when a reporter asks, "Has justice been served?" he asked. Justice is about more than retaliation. Restoration. And I wasn't the focus of this. It concerned each soldier who was informed they bled in places they didn't belong. To safeguard the echoing words rather than as a soundbite, but when presented as a sermon, the fact that belonged in every school in the courtroom, in the seat of authority in the past, a statue would be commissioned by someone other than Elijah. Generic grave guard towering over the rifle with rain hand looking ahead with there was a single plaque underneath it that said, "For when others sat, those who stood once Elijah Cross would come in private. Without warning, he would put A. At the base, a single folded flag stands in 60 seconds of silence. Then turn and move away, while his figure gradually fades away into the gentle gray mist that enveloped the graveyard, not as a representation as a guy who did what was right, but as a hero just when everyone wanted him to get smaller, and he did. So by reminding a whole honorable country that doesn't require a highlight, it requires a spine that had at least once went inside that courtroom with Elijah, had become a shout, not one of rage, but of waking, and as others discussed, questioned, or attempted to distort the story. Elijah. Krause just came back, responsibility standing at the tomb once more of the unidentified soldier, unarmed and motionless, and fearless. But now when visitors, they saw more than just a god as they passed him. They observed a country that was still under protection, not from adversaries overseas, but from forgetting who made the payment.